Game 3 of the World Championship match between Viswanathan Anand and Magnus Carlsen took place today. Carlsen had the white pieces and he started with knight f3. Well, he's repeating his first move from game 1. I must say I'm a little bit disappointed that he's not playing main lines with e4 and d4, something more forthright. But this is his style. He wants to just lob the ball over the net rather than going for a big smash. And Anand continued as he did in game 1 as well, playing very classically, putting his pawn in the centre of the board. So everything as game 1. Now Carlsen varies with c4. Now I might have expected Anand to play very solidly with c6. Instead, he took on c4, so this imbalances the position. We've got different pawn structures now. Now, Carlsen can win this pawn back very easily, but there's imbalance in the pawn structure, which is good for the spectators. We know we're going to get a more interesting game, and that's what happened today. Let's see. So, Carlsen developed some pieces and then recovered the pawn. And we've actually got a position which is like a reverse dragon variation. The important thing to note here is the pawn structure. Black has this pawn in the centre of the board which gives black more space, but white has a very solid pawn structure indeed. So behind the first 3 ranks, but no weaknesses at all. Now let's see how things develop. I'm going to zip through these first few moves because I want to get to a critical moment in the game a bit later on. Now Anand plays a good move, knight d4. Really, white can't live with this knight in the middle of the board and has to exchange it off. Now you can see that with that move the pawn structure changes. Black has this pawn on d4 now, and that rather cramps the pawn on e2. If black can somehow quell white's play with his pieces, drive white's pieces back, then he might be able to get pressure on this semi-open e-file. I'm talking much later on in the game. But in the meantime, white has very good play, or potentially very good play, with his minor pieces. This knight might hop into c5. This bishop is quite active. This bishop has great potential on the long diagonal, and the queen is active as well. So the pawn here gives black a space advantage. White is fighting with his pieces. Let's see how the players dealt with this. Well, c6, good move from Anand. That shuts out the bishop on g2. So bishop b4, dangerous activity from Carlsen. Looking at this nice diagonal, perhaps looking to sink a knight in on d6. But now Anand found, I think, an excellent manoeuvre. You'll notice how he's delayed developing this bishop on c8. Now that was important, otherwise this knight might have floated in to hit b7 and this bishop could be good. But he's delayed it until he can play this bishop out and get it to this square d5 without worrying about any irritating move like knight c5. Very good manoeuvre. And I think from this moment on, Carlsen really, I think he felt a little bit uncomfortable. He's not going to get anything from the position. The problem is when he moves this knight, then Anand will be able to trade bishops, and that will give this queen perhaps freedom to come up the board. It's very difficult for Carlsen to generate play now. After some minutes thought, he found a4, which is a little bit obscure, but basically, well, we'll see that he's hoping to open a file on the queen side. But I think it's not really dangerous. Another excellent move from Anand. You can see how he's starting to shut out white's minor pieces, so the knight can no longer go to c5. And now there's a clear threat in the position of playing c5, shutting out this bishop. Now, Carlsen really, I think, has nothing better than how he played in the game, and that's to exchange off the bishop for the knight. But that you can see how that frees black's position. Now the rooks are connected, the queen is on this very nice semi-open file. So now we see Carlsen's idea. He plays a5, so he knew b6 was coming and thought, well, at least he can perhaps try to open up a file here. But Anand plays very calmly. He's just protects everything. Carlsen can't do very much here at all. Rook c8. Well, we'll see that, yeah, Anand has something in mind here. He would very much like to advance his pawns down the board. And really, Carlsen hasn't got very much play in this position. And he played his queen out to f4, which is, well, superficially it seems quite active, quite dangerous. But actually, you can see that there are no real weaknesses in black's pawn structure on the king's side. You know, these squares are very well protected by the bishop. So everything's solid there. These pawns protect very good squares as well. And Anand dealt with the pressure very well, or the slight pressure. I mean, a knight or a queen might want to come into d6. So Anand just played rook d8. And now h4, well, sometimes it's good to prevent g5. Now an excellent move from Anand. If he strikes out too quickly and tries to trap this queen, then the queen can take on h6. So that's why, in this position, he played king h7. Now that looks very modest. In fact, now it threatens f5. For example, if rook a6, well, then we play f5, and you'll notice that the queen actually has no squares in that position. It's trapped. So Carlsen had to retreat, and the tide is beginning to turn in Anand's favour, and Carlsen was using up more and more time here. The bishop hit the queen, and now Anand, I thought Anand was going to perhaps repeat the position and play bishop d5, and we'd have another repetition of moves and a draw. But instead, Anand played for the win with h5. Now this pushes white's queen into the corner. Now, it looks like it's well out of play. Now, it's not too bad because it's on this diagonal. But it is a long way from the queen side, and Anand exploits this fact to take the initiative there. So Carlsen played knight e4, a little bit of activity. Okay, the king will just preempt the knight coming here. The knight came here anyway. Now, I was expecting Anand to save this bishop, to keep the bishop pair, you know, perhaps retreat the bishop. But then I think white might be okay here. But instead, Anand very quickly played b5. So he's not bothering about saving this bishop, because he knows what he's trying to do is force this pawn through with c4 and then c3. Now that is a really dangerous pass pawn, and Carlsen started to think a lot here. He had to invest a lot of time, and suddenly he found himself in time pressure. He realised that things could be looking bad on the queen side, and he played a very daring move here. He's striving for activity. He played e3. Anand exchanged. And here is one of the critical moments in the game. Anand played bishop d4 here. The question is, why didn't he take on b2? Why didn't he snap this pawn off? Well, let's take a look. I can understand why he didn't, because suddenly, this was Carlsen's idea, he would gain lots of activity on the e-file. If black defends with rook b6, then this pin is very annoying. There's more pressure here. Now, it still looks as though Anand is okay here. I repeat, this is a possible variation. This didn't happen. Now, rook takes bishop. This is very tricky indeed. And rook takes. Now, if rook takes rook, then you can see there's a knight fork. And if the king moves, we can take here, and I think white should be fine there. But queen f8 is very interesting. Threatening queen takes f2. I'm going into this variation in some detail because a lot of people thought that maybe this was a way for Anand to play for a win. Well, it might be. But I don't think this is easy for black, and I can understand why Anand didn't want to go in for this, because you can see, although Anand has won material here, his king is very exposed, and things could go very easily wrong here. Now I think if black plays accurately, he can get some advantage, but this is very tricky. I mean, let me show you. For example, if rook takes d5, hoping for queen takes and then a queen mate here, then rook takes b6, and suddenly this is fantastic for white. The rook coming in here, really, really dangerous. What else is there? Obviously, if this is taken, then that's a very nice family fork that hits everything. This is possible. I mean, you have to find this move first, and then king h2. All white is doing is sort of getting out of the way of this pawn, and then wants to bring his queen into play, possibly. And now, if queen takes f2, then rook e7 is very unpleasant for black. So bishop takes f2, but now queen e4, now white gets activity. Now I think black can actually survive this, and in fact, in this position, ends up a pawn up. But I have a feeling that with such good activity, that even though black is this pawn up, white should survive. But this is maybe the best that Anand had. But I can really understand why he didn't want to take on b2. Anand by this stage had about 15 minutes left for, well, 11 moves, so running slightly short of time. Carlsen was down to under 10 minutes. Anyway, Anand, instead of taking the pawn, kept control with bishop d4. Carlsen nudged the rook back. Anand played c4. Now what he's trying to do is trying to open the b file and get at this pawn on b2, for example, here. Then this pawn is very weak indeed. So instead, Carlsen defended very, very actively indeed. He played bishop e4. Now you can see that with this pawn exchange, the pawn on g6 has been weakened. So Carlsen is trying to activate his pieces, activate the queen in particular, as quickly as possible to generate some attack against black's king. So Anand has won a pawn, but the weakness of his king is about to tell. So, for example, if rook f8, trying to target this pawn here, then I think it's a good idea for white just to ditch this pawn and get activity. And I think white should be okay here. You know, black has to take care that there isn't a rook coming down here, and you know, this pawn can be very weak indeed. Okay, let's have a look at the game. So Anand took on b2. Carlsen activated his queen before taking on d3, and I think this is good strategy. And now you could see that Anand basically realised he wasn't going to win this position and wanted to steer the game towards a draw. If black plays too hard for the win here, I know he's got an extra pawn on this side of the board, his king side is too weak. That pawn in particular on g6 and the weakened 7th rank. Black could easily lose this. So Anand played very pragmatically and just traded pieces and was content to steer the game towards a draw. So this is what happened. Basically, they exchanged off all the pieces, and well, over these next few moves, there's not a lot going on. Basically, yeah, all the pawns got traded off the board. I'll just go to the end of the game, but they'd reached the time control, and now there were no draws offered. They basically exchanged off absolutely everything in this position, and instead of actually agreeing a draw, let's see what happened. Shows they both have a sense of humour. So there we go. Finally, a draw. Anand certainly had chances, but yes, at that critical moment, Carlsen appreciated he was in some danger and played e3 and gained just about enough activity to hold the draw.